So today I'm changing the spark plugs on my Subaru, but that'll be in a build video in the future. But I wanted to make this video about spark plugs themselves since I've learned a lot about them recently. I hear a lot of people talk about different aspects of a spark plug and I never really knew why. A lot of people talk about running one step colder when you turbo it or supercharge it. In fact, I'm running one step colder on the Escort. And of course, one of the spark plugs for my Subaru is cracked, and it's a $13 spark plug, which is not cheap. This is an NGK Iridium spark plug with a gap of 32 thousandths of an inch and a heat range of 6. And if you had said that weeks ago, I would have totally glazed over. But I feel like as a car enthusiast, it's important to know all aspects of modifying your car. And one of those aspects is definitely spark plugs. Now when you talk about modifying cars, you very rarely hear people talk about spark plugs. And that's because it's a lot easier for people to talk about what turbo they're going to run or what blow-off valve will sound better on their car than it is about spark plugs. And I think spark plugs aren't really a modification that necessarily add power to your car. It's kind of a necessity to keep it running, and to keep it running most efficiently. But I'll tell you what, if I modified my Escort and not changed out the plugs, I would have to tune it conservatively, which means less power, and nobody wants that. So let's talk about spark plugs and which plug you need to run in your car to run most efficiently to make as much power as possible. Most of the time, it's going to be the stock plug.
Now before I go any further, I wanted to make it clear that I'm not a spark plug expert. I've done my thorough internet research, but that doesn't make me an expert. So I talked to my friend Charles about this, who is an expert.
Hey everybody, I'm Charles from HumbleMechanic.com. I am a VW master technician, spent about 15 years fixing broken Volkswagens. When it comes to changing spark plugs, it's a great DIY piece of maintenance, but typically I recommend going with the OEM plugs. The manufacturers do put a lot of time and money into R&D and testing to make sure that your car is going to run properly with the right spark plug. In almost every case, that is the factory plug. Now, if you're going to modify your car lightly, like an intake or an exhaust, stick with the factory plug too. If you're going way heavy in the modification, perhaps turbocharging it, stick with what the tuner recommends as a baseline with the gap as well. That's going to be a really good starting point. You may have to make some tweaks and go one range colder, for example, on a turbocharged car, but get the factory plugs in there first and see how the car performs.
While it's unlikely that your car will blow up from the wrong spark plug, it is likely that it'll run rough and inefficient. I can't express again how important it is to run the factory plug, but in some situations with modification, the factory plug just doesn't work out. So I went to Advanced Auto Parts to buy every variant of spark plug that I could find to show you all the different configurations. I'll walk you through the 4 primary aspects of spark plugs so you can have a little more knowledge in case you plan to go nuts with modification.
Now, a special thank you to Advanced Auto Parts for sponsoring this video and putting up with us buying 16 different spark plugs to show for you guys in this video. We don't have any sponsorships here. We're not being selective with the brands of spark plugs that we're using, but you can get all these brands at Advanced Auto Parts. So there's 4 major aspects to spark plugs that I want to talk about in this video, and the first of them is gap. Now gap is basically the distance between the ground electrode and the core. When people talk about gapping their spark plugs, that just means that you're changing the distance between the two. You're either making it further apart or closer together. If you have a gap that's set too far, the spark plug might not even fire at all, but if you set it too closely, there's not going to be very much spark there. It's just a very small spark, which might not be enough to fully combust the engine cylinders.
There's 3 methods that people use to check the gap on their spark plugs: coin-style gap measure, wire coin gap, and a feeler gauge. But be careful when you're changing the gap. You should only change it up to 3 times. Any more and you risk breaking off the ground electrode. Typically, the higher the compression on the engine, the smaller the gap should be. It's harder for spark to occur in a higher compression, so the closer the gap, the easier it should be to fire. But if you set the gap too close, the spark may be too weak to ignite combustion. The gap doesn't impact the temperature of the spark plug though, but that's the next aspect that we're going to talk about.
The sheath around the core here is an insulator, and you can run different temperature spark plugs by having a different size insulator. Some are more insulated than others, and that kind of signifies how cold or hot that the spark plug will run. The temperature of the spark plug doesn't actually mean the spark plug burns any hotter or any colder. That means basically how much it dissipates heat, how much it can retain that heat.
The temperature of your spark plug is very important. If you're running too hot of a plug, it could potentially pre-detonate, causing serious damage to your internals. But if you're running too cold of a plug, it could build up carbon deposits, reducing the strength of the spark, thus reducing power and longevity of the plug. You want your spark plug to be between 450 and 850 degrees Celsius in operation. The manufacturer knows which heat range spark plug you should be using to be in that temperature range, so go with that recommended heat range. But if you're boosted, pushing hotter air into the engine, you might want to consider a few ranges colder to stay in that optimal temperature range.
So the third factor is the core material. The core material is basically what is inside the spark plug. What is the conductor that's making the electricity travel through it? The most common of which I would say is copper, and that's because it's the cheapest and definitely the most conductive. It makes the best spark. And you can get these copper spark plugs for like $2 or $3. But then you start getting into the platinum plugs, which is obviously a much more rare metal material than copper, so it's a little bit more expensive, but it doesn't actually conduct as well as copper does. But the reason that you'd run it is because it lasts a lot longer. Now, double platinum is the same thing as platinum. It just has platinum on both the core and the ground electrode. I guess that helps make it last a little bit longer as well. I don't know, it sounds really cool. Then you have iridium, which is another material in of itself. And iridium is a little bit more conductive than platinum, which is nice. And it's also a little bit more long-lasting than copper, which is also nice. The downside is that it's very expensive. The spark plug that came in my Subaru is, of course, iridium, so it's $13. And they do typically run around that price range. I've seen them up to $16 before, and probably more than that. That's the pros and cons of all the different core materials. And the fourth and final aspect that I want to talk about is the ground electrode itself. So that is basically how many grounds there are to the core material of the spark plug.
There are dual ground electrodes, 4 ground electrodes, and all sorts of weird stuff in between. Based on a research article that I'll link below, more ground electrodes might mean that the plug will last longer, but 1 ground electrode performs better, so that's what I'd recommend.
I did have a friend have a ground electrode break off in his engine before, cracking his engine block, which is not very fun. So I think the less ground electrodes I can have in my engine, the better, but that's just a personal preference.
Before I finish this video, I think it's important to understand how to check your spark plugs after they've seen some use. So the best way for me to show you all examples was to go to the junkyard and try to find some bad spark plugs. I think the main thing you'll notice from old plugs is how rich or lean your engine is running. This can be seen by the color of the plug. If the plug is dark and black, it's likely running rich, but if it's dry with white spots, it's likely running lean. Most cars will be running in the optimal air to fuel ratio, but some modified cars might be a bit off, so this is a good way to check. Also, spark plugs will most likely wear in 2 areas. The gap will extend over time, like this spark plug.
Look at the gap on that. Can you see that?
This car was probably misfiring because of how far apart the gap is. You shouldn't adjust the gap on a used spark plug though, as you could increase the chance of the ground electrode breaking off. Another wear spot that you might see is the core eroding. You'll notice rounded edges that indicate a lot of engine use or possible detonation. It's best to change your spark plugs out at the manufactured recommended interval, but I feel like that's a bit obvious. I hope this video helped you gain some knowledge about spark plugs. I learned a lot just in the making of this video, and I encourage you all to research on your own. Running the correct spark plug can make a huge difference in the performance of your car. You're likely going to want to run the stock plug, but if you're crazy modified, hopefully this video helped point you in the right direction. So, until next time, thanks for watching.